Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Daniel Rivers moved to the peaceful town of Ashwood, Montana, he never imagined his tranquil escape would spark a battle of epic proportions. What began as a quiet life with a dream hot tub turned into a fight against a power-hungry HOA president. Little did Daniel know, his stand would change everything. Daniel Rivers had always dreamt of escaping the bustling chaos of urban life. As a 36-year-old structural engineer, he spent countless hours crafting designs that would shape city skylines, yet he yearned for simplicity and serenity. When the opportunity arose to relocate to the peaceful town of Ashwood, Montana, he seized it without hesitation. The allure of crisp mountain air, picturesque landscapes, and a slower pace of life was irresistible. His new home, nestled at the edge of town, promised all of that and more. The property was a slice of paradise. It featured a charming ranch-style house surrounded by lush greenery, with the backdrop of rugged mountains and endless skies. But what truly sold Daniel on this particular house was the hot tub. Sitting on a stone patio at the edge of his backyard, it was the perfect retreat for a man who spent his days buried in blueprints and deadlines. After moving in, he wasted no time turning the space into his personal sanctuary, adorning the area around the hot tub with potted plants and soft outdoor lighting. For the first few weeks, life in Ashwood was everything Daniel had hoped for. Mornings began with the sound of birds chirping, and evenings ended with him soaking in the steaming water of his hot tub, watching the stars glimmer against the dark expanse of the Montana sky. The sense of peace was palpable, a stark contrast to the unrelenting grind of his previous life. However, tranquility has a way of drawing the attention of those who see it as a challenge. One quiet evening, as Daniel was leaning back in the hot tub with a glass of wine in hand, the serenity was shattered by the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. He sat up, startled, and spotted a figure approaching. The woman who entered his backyard carried herself with an air of authority. Her severe blonde bob pastel blazer and stiff posture screamed suburban disciplinarian. Without preamble, she announced herself. "I'm Susan Hadley, president of the Ashwood Meadows Homeowners Association," she declared, her voice clipped. "You're in violation of our neighborhood guidelines." Daniel blinked, trying to make sense of her intrusion. "Excuse me, I think there's a mistake. I'm not part of the HOA," he replied, still sitting in the tub, steam rising around him. Susan's expression hardened. "Every property in this neighborhood falls under the HOA's jurisdiction," she countered, "and hot tubs are prohibited. You'll need to remove it immediately." Despite her imposing demeanor, Daniel felt a flicker of annoyance. "I'm sorry, but my realtor confirmed that this property isn't within the HOA boundary. I have the paperwork to prove it." Susan crossed her arms. "I've been president for over 10 years. I know every inch of this neighborhood. If you don't comply, you'll face fines and legal action." Daniel stood his ground, calmly explaining his rights and reiterating that his property was independent of the HOA. But Susan dismissed his explanations, issuing what sounded like a thinly veiled threat before storming off. As Daniel watched her retreating figure, his sense of unease grew. He had moved to Ashwood to find peace, but this encounter hinted at a storm brewing on the horizon. The hot tub, which had symbolized his fresh start, was now at the center of an unexpected and unwelcome confrontation. Daniel thought the encounter with Susan Hadley was nothing more than an awkward misunderstanding, one that would resolve itself once she reviewed his property records. Unfortunately, Susan had no intention of letting the matter rest. Within days, Daniel began to notice subtle but unsettling signs of escalation. It started with a letter taped to his front door, printed on HOA letterhead. It outlined an official violation notice citing unauthorized structures and demanding the removal of his hot tub within 7 days. Attached was a threat of fines amounting to $200 per day for non-compliance. Daniel sighed, frustrated by the persistence of the HOA president's erroneous claim. He immediately called his attorney, who assured him that Susan's demands were baseless. "I'll draft a cease and desist letter," the attorney said confidently. "This should put an end to her antics." But it didn't. The next evening, as Daniel returned from a trip to the local grocery store, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered near his driveway. They were whispering and shooting him curious glances. One of them, a wiry man in his 50s, finally approached. "You're Daniel, right?" the man asked, his tone both cautious and accusatory. "Yes, can I help you?" Daniel replied, already bracing himself for what was coming. "Well, I'm Paul. Susan told us you've been violating community rules and refusing to cooperate. She said your hot tub is an environmental hazard, something about water runoff contaminating the soil." Daniel's patience wore thin. "Paul, my property isn't part of the HOA. I have the documents to prove it. Whatever Susan is telling you is simply not true." Paul hesitated, then muttered, "I'd like to see those documents sometime," before walking away. By the end of the week, the tension had snowballed. Flyers began appearing on neighbors' doors, accusing Daniel of threatening the aesthetic integrity of Ashwood Meadows. The flyer included a doctored photo of his hot tub surrounded by exaggerated water damage and weeds, complete with captions warning of declining property values. The implication was clear. Daniel was the neighborhood villain. One night, while enjoying his hot tub despite the growing animosity, Daniel noticed the unmistakable sound of camera shutters. Looking around, he spotted a man crouched near his fence, snapping photos. "Hey!" Daniel shouted, leaping out of the tub and grabbing a towel. The man bolted before Daniel could reach him, disappearing into the shadows. The next day, Daniel installed additional security cameras around his property. The recordings didn't lie. Over the next few nights, they captured several individuals sneaking onto his land to take photos, leaving trash near the hot tub, and even scratching his fence. When Daniel presented the footage to the police, they acknowledged the trespassing, but explained that catching the perpetrators would be challenging without direct identification. Feeling cornered but not defeated, Daniel decided to take control of the narrative. He called a neighborhood meeting, inviting everyone except Susan. At the gathering, he brought copies of his property records, surveillance footage, and even a statement from his attorney. "Look, I understand you've all been told a version of events that paints me as the bad guy," Daniel began, his voice steady but firm. "The truth is, my property is not under HOA jurisdiction. Susan has been harassing me, and her actions are not only unethical, but also illegal. Here's the proof." Some neighbors were receptive, apologizing for their earlier judgments, but others remained skeptical. "Susan's been here for years," one neighbor said. "She's not perfect, but why would she target you without reason?" Daniel refrained from pointing out Susan's controlling tendencies, choosing instead to focus on facts. "I can't speak to her motivations, but I can assure you that I have every legal right to keep my hot tub. If anyone doubts this, my lawyer is happy to clarify." Despite his efforts, the meeting didn't completely shift public opinion. It was clear Susan's influence ran deep. The final straw came when Susan ignored the cease and desist letter. Emboldened by her disregard for legal boundaries, she organized what she called a community cleanup. This cleanup involved several HOA members marching onto Daniel's property, claiming to address non-compliance. Daniel was livid. He called the police and presented the officers with the cease and desist order, along with footage from his cameras. This time, the officers issued a formal warning to Susan and the others involved. Frustrated and aware that Susan wouldn't stop, Daniel escalated his response. He filed for a restraining order, specifically prohibiting Susan and any representatives of the HOA from entering his property. His attorney also began preparing a defamation lawsuit against the HOA for the flyers and baseless accusations. As he signed the paperwork for the restraining order, Daniel felt a mixture of relief and defiance. "Let's see her try to trespass now," he muttered. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Susan had been cornered, and Daniel sensed she was about to become even more desperate. The restraining order seemed to deliver a momentary calm. For a few days, Daniel's property was devoid of HOA interference, and he cautiously allowed himself to enjoy the quiet. Yet his instincts warned him the battle was far from over. That warning proved true one morning when his security system alerted him to unusual activity near the boundary of his land. When Daniel checked the live feed, his stomach dropped. A group of 4 people armed with shovels and surveying equipment was digging along the fence line. Among them, directing the operation with a clipboard in hand, was Susan Hadley herself. Fuming, Daniel immediately called the police. "This is Daniel Rivers at 17 Maplewood. I have an active restraining order against the HOA president, Susan Hadley, and she's currently trespassing on my property with a group digging without permission." The dispatcher assured him that officers were en route. While waiting, Daniel stepped outside, phone in hand, recording the scene. "Susan," he called out, his voice sharp, You're violating a court order. Leave now." Susan turned, her face a mask of feigned innocence. "We're conducting necessary environmental assessments," she replied curtly. "Your hot tub is leaking contaminants into community property." "That's a lie," Daniel retorted, holding up his phone. "I have video proof of my property's condition and this trespassing. The police are on their way." Susan's confidence faltered, but she doubled down. "You can't stop us. We have jurisdiction here." Daniel didn't need to respond. The sound of approaching sirens spoke for him. Moments later, 2 patrol cars pulled up and officers exited, their hands resting on their belts. Daniel provided them with the restraining order and video evidence of the group's activities. The officers wasted no time. Susan's flimsy excuses crumbled as she was confronted with the legal documents. Her team of diggers looked increasingly nervous, and one of them admitted, "She told us this was approved by the county." It wasn't. The officers arrested Susan for violating the restraining order, criminal trespass, and conspiracy to commit property damage. Her cohorts were cited and released, but not before the officers confiscated their tools and took statements. The situation escalated further when an investigation into the incident revealed an alarming scheme. Documents recovered from Susan's office showed she had been planning to fabricate evidence of soil contamination near Daniel's property. Her intent? To force local authorities to declare the land a hazard, giving the HOA grounds to demand its removal or impose hefty fines. News of Susan's arrest and her underhanded tactics spread quickly through the neighborhood. For many, it was the breaking point. Neighbors who had once supported her now turned their backs, appalled by her blatant abuse of power. Daniel, though exhausted by the ordeal, felt vindicated. He provided his attorney with the new evidence, bolstering his lawsuit against the HOA. The fallout for Susan, however, was just beginning. As she sat in custody, her decade-long reign over Ashwood Meadows began to unravel. The once intimidating president of the HOA was now the centerpiece of a public scandal. Daniel couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction as he watched the community finally see Susan for who she truly was. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had definitively turned in his favor. Susan Hadley's arrest marked a pivotal moment in the conflict. The HOA's grip on the community, once seen as unshakable, began to crumble under the weight of her exposed misdeeds. As local news outlets picked up the story, headlines detailing her attempted fraud and trespassing spread across Ashwood and beyond. Daniel, though relieved to see justice taking its course, remained cautious. He continued working closely with his attorney, who filed an updated lawsuit against both Susan and the HOA. The evidence of her conspiracy to fabricate soil contamination was irrefutable, and her blatant violation of the restraining order only strengthened Daniel's case. In court, Susan faced a series of damning charges: criminal trespass, property damage, and attempted fraud. Witnesses, including neighbors who had worked with her on the dig, testified against her. The recovered documents detailing her scheme left the jury with little doubt. The judge handed down a sentence of 4 years in prison, citing the severity of her actions and her abuse of authority. But the fallout didn't stop there. An independent audit of the HOA, ordered as part of the investigation, revealed years of financial mismanagement under Susan's leadership. She had funneled HOA funds into personal accounts, issued baseless fines to residents, and used the HOA's authority as a weapon to enforce her will. The HOA board was dissolved by court order, and remaining members were fined for their complicity or negligence. For Daniel, the resolution came in the form of a substantial financial settlement. The HOA was ordered to compensate him for legal fees, property repairs, and emotional distress. Additionally, they were required to fund the construction of a high privacy fence around his property, a gesture that symbolized his independence from their control. As the dust settled, Daniel reflected on the hard-fought victory. What began as a simple desire to enjoy his hot tub in peace had turned into a crusade for justice. The community, now free from Susan's tyrannical rule, began to heal. New leadership emerged, emphasizing transparency and fairness, and many neighbors reached out to Daniel to apologize for doubting him. In the end, Daniel's quiet determination had not only safeguarded his property, but also restored a sense of balance and accountability to Ashwood Meadows. With the ordeal behind him, he could finally step into his backyard, sink into his hot tub, and gaze at the stars in uninterrupted peace. With Susan Hadley behind bars and the HOA's corrupt leadership dismantled, the Ashwood Meadows community began to undergo a transformation. The toxic atmosphere that had pervaded the neighborhood under Susan's reign was replaced by a renewed sense of cooperation and accountability. Daniel, once seen as an outsider and troublemaker, was now viewed as a hero by many of his neighbors. One of the first changes came from the court-ordered restructuring of the HOA. A newly elected board of residents, many of whom had been vocal critics of Susan, prioritized rebuilding trust within the community. They held open meetings, published transparent financial reports, and even included non-HOA homeowners like Daniel in advisory roles. As part of the settlement agreement, the HOA invested in projects that benefited the entire neighborhood. Streets that had been neglected for years were repaved, streetlights installed, and a once overgrown park was transformed into a vibrant community space with walking paths, a playground, and picnic areas. Daniel's insistence on fairness extended to suggesting that the HOA allocate funds for a community garden, an idea that quickly gained popularity among the residents. For Daniel, the ordeal became a source of inspiration. Neighbors who had once avoided him now greeted him warmly. Some even approached him for advice on navigating HOA disputes, emboldened by his success in standing up to authority. At first reluctant to relive the drama, Daniel soon realized that sharing his story could empower others. He accepted invitations to speak at local homeowner rights seminars, where he offered practical tips on understanding property laws and maintaining independence from overreaching associations. His backyard, once a symbol of conflict, became a gathering place for the community. Daniel hosted a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate the completion of the new park and garden, inviting all residents, whether they were HOA members or not. Laughter and conversation filled the air as families played on the freshly installed swings and neighbors shared stories over grilled burgers. Beyond Ashwood, Daniel's legal victory resonated in neighboring towns. News of the HOA's abuses and subsequent reforms spread, prompting other communities to scrutinize their own associations. Lawyers specializing in property rights cited his case as an example of the importance of standing firm against overreach. For Daniel, the most meaningful impact was personal. He no longer felt like an isolated newcomer, but a valued part of the neighborhood. He had transformed his initial desire for peace and solitude into a force for change that united a fractured community. On quiet evenings, as Daniel settled into his hot tub and gazed at the stars, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. What began as a battle for his property had turned into something far greater, a victory for fairness, community, and the simple right to enjoy one's home without interference. Months after the turmoil with Susan Hadley and the HOA, life in Ashwood Meadows had taken on a new rhythm, one of collaboration and mutual respect. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, had become a model of reform and unity. For Daniel Rivers, the journey had been exhausting, but it was also profoundly transformative. Sitting in his now iconic hot tub one crisp evening, Daniel reflected on how far things had come. He thought about the series of events that had started with a knock on his door and spiraled into a full-blown legal battle. The fight for his property had forced him to step out of his comfort zone, face relentless opposition, and navigate complex legal systems. Yet, through it all, he had emerged stronger and more confident in his convictions. The changes in the neighborhood were tangible. The new HOA leadership had not only repaired the fractured community, but also set a precedent for fairness and transparency. No longer were residents subjected to arbitrary fines or threats. The park and community garden stood as symbols of the collective victory, spaces where neighbors could connect and build lasting relationships. For Daniel, the experience offered lessons that extended far beyond the confines of Ashwood Meadows. He learned the importance of knowing one's rights, standing firm in the face of intimidation, and seeking allies in unexpected places. What had initially felt like an isolating struggle had revealed the power of resilience and persistence. Perhaps the most surprising outcome was the sense of belonging Daniel now felt. The neighbors who had once viewed him with suspicion now saw him as a unifying force, someone who had fought not just for himself, but for the integrity of their community. He was no longer just the man with the hot tub. He was a neighbor, a friend, and an advocate for fairness. As news of his story spread, Daniel received invitations to speak at homeowner advocacy events across the state. Though he was initially hesitant, he saw these as opportunities to share his journey and help others navigate their own challenges. "If there's one thing I've learned," he would often say, "it's that standing your ground isn't just about protecting your property. It's about protecting the principles that make a community strong." Looking out at the stars above his backyard, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. The fight had been worth it, not only for the tangible victories, but also for the personal growth and the stronger ties he had forged with his neighbors. What had started as a simple battle over a hot tub had turned into a transformative experience that redefined his place in the world. As the evening breeze rustled the leaves and the soft glow of the new park lights illuminated the distance, Daniel raised a toast to the future, his neighborhood's future, and the resilience that had brought them all together.